Picture this. It is just past midnight on September 26, 1983.
Oh, this is a tense one.
Yeah, it really is. So you are sitting in a secret underground military bunker just outside of Moscow. The air is stale. There's that constant hum of early computer systems, and you are just staring at a radar screen.
Right, just a normal shift.
Exactly. Until suddenly, the most terrifying sound in human history just completely shatters the quiet. A siren starts screaming, and a red sign flashes on your terminal in these giant, unforgiving letters. It just says, Elanashi.
I mean, it is the absolute worst-case scenario,
Yeah.
period. Because the computer systems are literally telling the man in that bunker, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov, that the United States have just fired intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Wow.
Right. And the radar says those nuclear warheads are hurtling toward the Soviet Union at, like, thousands of miles an hour.
And for you listening, you have to understand Petrov's standing orders here. They are crystal clear. If the system detects a launch, he is supposed to pick up the phone, call the Soviet leadership, and trigger a massive civilization-ending nuclear counterstrike.
Yeah. Standard operating procedure for the end of the world.
Literally. Millions of people in the U.S. and the USSR would be vaporized within the hour. The fate of humanity is quite literally sitting on this one guy's shoulders.
But Petrov, he actually stops and looks at the data. He knows this early warning system is brand new. He knows it has, well, glitches. And he makes this incredibly brave, just unimaginable calculation. He thinks, if the Americans were truly starting World War III, they wouldn't just send 5 missiles.
Right, they'd send everything.
Exactly. They would send hundreds. So he trusts his gut over the machine. He picks up the phone, and instead of launching, he reports a system malfunction.
He just does not launch the counterstrike.
No. And he was right. The so-called missiles were just sunlight reflecting off some high-altitude clouds.
It's just wild. Stanislav Petrov, a guy you have probably never even heard of, literally saved the world by choosing to do absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So welcome to this deep dive. If you are joining us right now, whether you are, say, a high school student frantically prepping for a history test, or you're just someone insanely curious about the hidden forces that built our modern reality, you are in exactly the right place.
Absolutely.
Because today, our mission is to travel back in time to decode the ultimate global chessboard. We are talking about the Cold War, spanning from roughly 1947 all the way to 1991.
And, that opening story with Petrov perfectly encapsulates what this entire era was all about.
It really does.
It was this 44-year global standoff. Two absolute heavyweights, the United States and the Soviet Union, just circling each other in the ring, both armed with enough nuclear weapons to end human history, but never, ever actually throwing a direct punch at one another on a traditional battlefield.
Right. Which is why I always tell people, don't let the word war confuse you here.
Good point.
Because when we usually talk about conflicts, there's this expectation of, precision. You look at a map, you see 2 armies clashing. There's a clear start date, a clear end date.
Yeah, like World War II.
Exactly. But the Cold War wasn't a traditional war. It was murky. It was psychological. It was fought in the shadows, in proxy nations, up in space, and frankly, in the minds of everyday citizens.
Which is why our roadmap for you today is going to be incredibly comprehensive. To understand the geopolitical map you live on right now, you really have to understand the mechanics of this standoff.
Okay, let's unpack this.
We are going to explore the origins of this massive ideological divide, right? How 2 completely distinct worldviews cleave the planet in half. We'll look at how it fundamentally reshaped international security, completely changing the map with these devastating regional proxy wars.
We are also going to take you completely off the earthly battlefield to look at the intense competitions in technology, the space race, and even sports diplomacy.
Oh, the sports diplomacy is fascinating.
It really is. And we're going to examine that heavy psychological toll, what it was actually like for ordinary people to live their daily lives under the constant looming shadow of a mushroom cloud.
And finally, we will trace the geopolitical dominoes that fell, one by one, leading to the sudden and honestly shocking collapse of the Soviet Union.
Okay, so we need to start in the messy, chaotic aftermath of the Second World War. The year is 1945. The dust is literally still settling over a completely devastated Europe and Asia.
Total devastation.
Right. Now, during World War II, the U.S. and the USSR were allies. They fought on the exact same side to defeat Nazi Germany. But almost the minute the war ends, these former friends turn into the most bitter of rivals. How does that happen so incredibly fast?
Well, to understand that rapid, profound breakdown, you really have to look beneath the surface alliance.
Yeah.
You have to understand the fundamental ideological chasm between them.
Right.
Because it wasn't just a disagreement over borders, it was a disagreement over reality itself, over how human society should function.
That's a great way to put it.
You have the Western Bloc, led by the United States, which is built on a capitalist economic system and liberal democratic political structures. And on the other side, you have the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, operating on a communist, specifically Marxist-Leninist system.
Let's actually pause right there and break those terms down for you listening, because, these words get thrown around a lot in the news today. But what actually is the mechanism here? What is the difference on a purely practical level?
It really comes down to two things: who holds power and how society distributes its resources.
Okay.
Under the Western capitalist model, you have private ownership. Individuals and corporations own the businesses, the land, the factories. The economy is driven by the free market.
Meaning price signals, right?
Exactly. Price signals determine what gets made. So if a lot of people want to buy bicycles, the demand goes up, the price goes up, and private businesses naturally decide to make more bicycles to make a profit.
Makes sense.
And politically, this system is paired with multi-party democracy, where citizens vote for their leaders, and the power of the state is, theoretically at least, limited by individual rights.
Okay, so a decentralized system driven by supply, demand, and individual choice.
Right. Now, contrast that with the Soviet Marxist-Leninist model. This is a command economy. The state, meaning the government, owns the means of production.
So no private corporations.
None. There are no free market price signals. Instead, you have a centralized bureaucracy sitting in Moscow planning the entire economy. They decide exactly how many bicycles to make, what price they will be sold for, and who gets them.
Which sounds incredibly complicated to manage.
It is. The ultimate goal, in Marxist theory, is to create a classless, equal society where wealth is distributed fairly.
Right, the theory sounds appealing to a lot of people.
It does. But in practice, to enforce this massive level of economic control, the political system requires absolute authoritarianism. You get a single-party state with strict censorship and zero political opposition.
So you literally have two completely incompatible worldviews about how human beings should live. And the reality on the ground in 1945 reflects this tension immediately.
It really does.
Because the Red Army, the Soviet military, had pushed all the way to Berlin to defeat the Nazis, which meant that after the war, they were physically occupying massive swaths of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, they were just there.
And instead of packing up and going home, the Soviets started installing satellite governments. By 1949, they had effectively set up regimes in places like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and even all the way over in North Korea.
And we must clarify what a satellite state actually meant in this context. These countries technically had their own governments and their own flags.
They looked independent on a map.
Right. But every major political, economic, and military decision was dictated directly by Moscow.
Wow.
The Soviet Union viewed this as creating a necessary buffer zone. We have to remember, they just lost over 20 million people in World War II from a Western invasion.
20 million, that's just an unfathomable number.
It is. So they wanted friendly communist states between them and Germany. It was a security measure. But the West, naturally, viewed this as aggressive imperial expansion.
And this physical and ideological division creates what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain.
Yes, the Iron Curtain.
It's this massive political and military barrier dividing Europe down the middle, slicing right through Germany itself. It isolated the Eastern Bloc from the West, and the diplomatic rhetoric on both sides just heated up incredibly fast.
It really did. If we look at 1946, the gloves completely come off.
Yeah.
You have the U.S. Secretary of State, James F. Burns, giving this major speech in Stuttgart, Germany.
Okay, set the scene for this.
Well, prior to this speech, there was this proposal called the Morgenthau Plan floating around Washington. The Morgenthau Plan actually suggested completely deindustrializing Germany.
Wait, deindustrializing, like tearing down the factories?
Literally tearing down the factories, partitioning the country, and turning it back into a purely agricultural farming state so it could never physically start another world war.
Which, if you think about it, is just a wild idea. Germany was the industrial heart of Europe. If you turn it into a giant farm, you fundamentally cripple the entire center of the European economy. Like, there would be mass starvation.
Precisely. It would have been a humanitarian and economic disaster.
Yeah.
So Burns steps up to the microphone, publicly repudiates the Morgenthau Plan, and then delivers this massive warning to the Soviets.
What does he say?
He essentially says, The United States intends to maintain a military presence in Europe indefinitely to protect it. He noted later that this was really a battle over the minds of the German people.
Ah, winning them over.
Right. By rebuilding Germany rather than destroying it, the U.S. was drawing a massive line in the sand against Soviet expansion.
But I want to make sure we're looking at this objectively for you listening, because if you are sitting in Moscow, you aren't seeing the U.S. as the quote-unquote good guys protecting Europe. You are deeply, deeply suspicious.
Oh, absolutely.
In that exact same year, 1946, there's a highly classified document sent from the Soviet ambassador in Washington back to Moscow. It's called the Novikov Telegram.
Yes, commissioned by Vyacheslav Molotov, a very top Soviet diplomat.
And the Novikov Telegram paints the United States in the starkest, most threatening terms imaginable. It described the U.S. government as being entirely in the grip of monopoly capitalists.
And what do monopoly capitalists want, according to Soviet theory?
Unending expansion.
Unending expansion in new markets, exactly. The telegram warned that the U.S. was rapidly building up its military capability for one specific reason: to prepare the conditions for winning world supremacy in a new, inevitable war.
So you have a complete breakdown of trust. Washington thinks Moscow is aggressively expanding an authoritarian empire. Moscow thinks Washington is a capitalist empire plotting world domination.
It's just an echo chamber of extreme paranoia.
And this extreme paranoia leads directly to the official strategy of the United States, declared in 1947 the Truman Doctrine. The core of this doctrine is a word that basically defines the entire era: containment.
Containment, yes. The idea was not to invade the Soviet Union and overthrow communism where it already existed. I mean, that would trigger World War III.
Right, nobody wanted that.
So the strategy was that wherever communism threatened to expand its borders, the U.S. would step in with political, economic, or military force to contain it. Just box it in.
Now, you might be wondering how containment actually works in practice. To make this real for you listening, I always use this analogy. Don't think about it like a military battlefield.
Okay.
Think of it like dealing with a massive water leak in a house. Instead of fighting the water at the source, which is too dangerous, you try to seal off every single room around it so the water just can't spread.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Or, to use the American perspective at the time, think of communism like a highly contagious virus. If a country is economically healthy, with a strong middle class, its immune system is strong, and it will reject the virus.
But in 1947, Europe is in ruins.
Exactly. People are starving. The immune system is completely shot. In that environment of total desperation, the promise of communism that the state will feed everyone and distribute wealth equally looks incredibly appealing.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the logic in Washington at the time. The U.S. realized that you can't just fight an ideology with bullets. You have to fight it with economics.
Right.
And that leads to one of the most significant foreign policy initiatives in history: the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948.
Right, the vitamin injection for Europe's immune system.
Exactly. The Marshall Plan was a massive injection of U.S. financial aid. We're talking billions of dollars, specifically designed to rebuild the shattered economies and infrastructure of Western Europe.
Just giving them cash to rebuild.
And the mechanism was simple but brilliant. Use American money to rebuild European factories, get people back to work, and create a prosperous middle class.
Because a person who has a good job, a home, and food on the table has way too much to lose to risk a violent communist revolution.
Exactly. But the Soviets aren't just sitting there quietly watching American dollars flood into Europe. They see the Marshall Plan as a capitalist trick to buy European loyalty.
A bribe, basically.
Right. So they counter it by creating an organization called Cominform in 1947.
Cominform, what did that do?
It stands for the Communist Information Bureau. It was designed to enforce strict orthodoxy within the international communist movement.
Ah, keeping everyone in line.
Moscow realized they needed to tighten their grip. They wanted to ensure that the satellite states in the Eastern Bloc rejected Marshall Plan money, which, by the way, some of them desperately wanted.
Oh, I'm sure they did.
But Moscow forced them to reject it and remain perfectly aligned with Soviet policies.
And just in case anyone in the West thought the Soviets were bluffing about tightening that grip, 1948 delivers a massive shock to the system.
The Czech coup.
Yes. Czechoslovakia was the last state in the Eastern Bloc that still had a coalition government and some democratic structures. But in early 1948, the Czech communists execute a brutal coup d'etat.
It was ruthless.
They take over the government entirely, crushing any opposition. For the West, this was a massive wake-up call. The public brutality of this takeover swept away any remaining resistance to the Marshall Plan in the U.S. Congress.
It proved to everyone that the Iron Curtain was slamming shut permanently.
Which logically moves us into the next major phase of our deep dive. The ideological lines are drawn in the dirt, the economies are splitting, but how does this division permanently alter global security?
Right, because the fear generated by events like the Czech coup leads directly to the militarization of these two blocs.
Because if you genuinely believe the other side is an existential threat aiming to destroy your way of life, you team up and you arm yourself to the teeth.
Exactly.
So in 1949, the West forms NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, fundamentally, NATO was designed as a collective defensive agreement for the West. The core principle is Article 5, right?
Yeah.
An attack on one member is considered an attack on all of them.
And in response, eventually in 1955, the Soviet Union forms its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, tying its Eastern European satellite states together.
Okay, let's talk about the Warsaw Pact.
Well, nominally, on paper, the Warsaw Pact was also a defensive military alliance against the West. But if we analyze the actual historical record, it practically functioned to safeguard Soviet hegemony over its own sphere of influence.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this. Are you saying the Warsaw Pact never actually fought NATO?
Correct. The only direct, large-scale military actions the Warsaw Pact ever took were invading its own member states.
You're kidding. Invading their own allies.
Yes, to stop them from adopting democratic reforms or breaking away from Soviet control. We saw this tragically when Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary in 1956 and again into Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring in 1968.
Wow.
It was a mechanism of internal control just as much as external defense.
So you have these two massively armed camps staring each other down across the borders of Europe. But here is where the mechanics of war fundamentally change forever.
The nuclear arsenals.
Yes. Both sides rapidly developed nuclear weapons. The U.S. dropped atomic bombs in 1945, and the Soviets shocked the world by testing their first nuclear weapon just 4 years later in 1949.
Which nobody in the West expected them to do that fast.
Right. And this creates a strategic doctrine called mutually assured destruction, or MAD.
It is a terrifying but honestly incredibly effective deterrent. Mutually assured destruction means that both sides have enough nuclear weapons to completely annihilate the other, even if the other side strikes first.
So there's no way to win.
None. Therefore, starting a direct war is suicidal. If a single Soviet tank rolls across the border into West Germany or an American tank rolls into East Berlin, it triggers a chain reaction that ends with nuclear fire raining down on Washington and Moscow.
So because a direct war in Europe literally means the end of the world, Europe basically freezes in place. The borders lock. But the ideological conflict doesn't just stop, right?
Oh no, it just moves.
They just export the violence. They take the fight out of Europe and move it to the rest of the globe. And this introduces us to the era of the proxy wars.
And to understand the geography of these proxy wars, we need to clarify some terminology that was born during this era. Terms you still hear used today, often incorrectly. The first, second, and third worlds.
Yes, let's define these. Because today, people usually use third world to just mean, a poor or developing country. But that is not what it originally meant at all, right?
Not at all. Originally, these terms were strictly political alignments. The First World referred to the United States and its capitalist democratic allies in Western Europe, Japan, and elsewhere.
Okay, First World is the Western Bloc.
Right. The Second World was the Soviet Union, China, and the Communist Eastern Bloc.
And the Third World.
I literally just referred to everyone else, the non-aligned countries.
And it is absolutely crucial for you to understand the timing here. While the U.S. and USSR are locking horns in Europe, the old European empires are collapsing everywhere else.
Decolonization.
Exactly. Following World War II, you have a massive wave of decolonization happening across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Dozens of newly independent nations are being born, finally throwing off British, French, or Dutch colonial rule.
And these newly independent third world states suddenly become the active battlegrounds of the Cold War.
Because both superpowers are looking for allies.
They look at the global map and they see a zero-sum game. The logic was so paranoid. If a newly independent country in Africa or Asia aligns with the U.S., the Soviets see it as a dangerous loss of global influence, and vice versa.
I have to jump in here and bring up the domino theory, because this explains why Washington cared so much about what happened in tiny, far-off
Oh,
nations.
the domino theory was central to U.S. foreign policy.
Right. The U.S. believed that if one nation in a region fell to communism, the surrounding nations would fall like a row of dominoes. One knocks over the next, knocks over the next.
Exactly. And because of that intense paranoia on both sides, we really have to look objectively at the actions of both superpowers during this time.
Yeah, we have to look at the facts.
Because the moral compromises made in the name of this conflict were staggering. The United States, in its mission to stop the spread of communism at literally all costs, routinely supported anti-communist movements that were incredibly brutal.
They heavily funded right-wing military dictatorships.
They did. And they actively backed covert uprisings that overthrew democratically elected governments.
Like in Iran in 1953 or Guatemala in 1954.
Precisely. Simply because those governments were deemed too sympathetic to socialism, or because they threatened American corporate interests.
And identically, the Soviet Union, aiming to expand global communism and fatally weaken Western influence, poured massive funding into Second World left-wing parties.
They armed violent wars of national liberation.
Yes, and they enthusiastically supported brutal left-wing dictatorships. Both sides used economic aid, weapons sales, and CIA or KGB espionage to just manipulate the political destinies of sovereign nations all over the globe.
Which brings up a central, deeply tragic paradox of the Cold War.
What's that?
The so-called long peace. The fact that Europe and North America didn't see World War III was bought at the direct cost of devastating, bloody conflicts in the global South.
I really want you listening to think about this. Did creating NATO and the Warsaw Pact actually prevent a war? Or did it just export the violence, the destruction, and the instability to developing nations?
It's a heavy question.
Because for the people living in those proxy battlegrounds, the Cold War wasn't a standoff. It wasn't cold at all. It was extremely hot and incredibly deadly.
The human cost was immense. Just look at the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. The Communist North, backed by the Soviets and China, invaded the South, which was backed by the U.S. and the United Nations.
And the casualty numbers are just horrific.
Millions of civilians and soldiers died, and the result, a bloody stalemate, with the peninsula divided exactly where it started at the 38th parallel.
And then, of course, the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975, a massive, incredibly destructive proxy conflict that eventually ended in a crushing withdrawal for the United States and a communist victory.
Right. The violence was very, very real in the Third World.
But I do want to point out that these massive ideological blocs, the First and Second Worlds, they weren't always perfectly solid. The geopolitical chessboard was actually a lot messier than just us versus them. Let's look at the Tito-Stalin split.
Ah, yes. A perfect example of nuance in this era.
Break it down for us.
So Yugoslavia was a communist country in Eastern Europe led by Josip Broz Tito. Ideologically, they were Marxists.
Okay, so firmly in the Soviet camp, you'd think.
You'd think. But Tito, who had actually led his own partisan resistance to liberate his country during WWII without much Soviet help, he fiercely protected his national sovereignty.
He wasn't about to be a puppet.
Exactly. He simply refused to take direct orders from Joseph Stalin in Moscow.
Right. Tito essentially says, we are communists, but we aren't your puppets. He breaks away from common form, successfully manages to keep Yugoslavia non-aligned, and remarkably, this communist dictator even starts accepting financial and military aid from the capitalist United States.
It just goes to show that national interests and personal rivalries often complicated those neat ideological boxes we try to put history into.
But as if these earthly geopolitical battlefields weren't complex enough, the intense pressure of the Cold War just couldn't be contained by gravity.
No, it could not.
Because the borders on Earth were essentially frozen by the threat of nuclear weapons, the superpowers had nowhere left to demonstrate their ideological superiority.
No.
Well, except upwards.
Up into the stars.
Exactly. It spilled over into culture, into sports, and literally into space. Okay, let's explore the competitions, starting with the space race, because this is one of the most iconic parts of the era.
It really is.
I want you to put yourself in the shoes of an average American in the fall of 1957. You go out to your backyard, you look up at the night sky, and you hear on your radio this faint, repeating sound. Beep, beep, beep.
What's fascinating here is the sheer psychological shock of the Sputnik crisis. In August 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM.
Which is terrifying on its own.
Absolutely. And then, just weeks later in October, they used that exact same rocket technology to launch Sputnik 1, the first artificial Earth satellite.
And it was just a little metal ball with radio antennas. It didn't do anything but beep. But you cannot overstate the absolute panic this caused in Washington and across the U.S.
Total panic.
Why? Because the CIA and the military looked at Sputnik and realized this wasn't just a fun science fair project. It wasn't about the little beeping metal ball. It was about the rocket that put it there.
Exactly. Sputnik was a stupendous scientific achievement, sure, but militarily it proved that the USSR had perfected an ICBM capable of hitting practically any desired target on Earth with terrifying accuracy.
The logic was inescapable. If the Soviets had a rocket powerful enough to put a satellite in orbit, they had a rocket powerful enough to drop a nuclear warhead on Washington, D.C.
And there was absolutely nothing the U.S. could do to stop it.
The space race was born directly from that military panic. It was framed to the public as this noble quest for human exploration. But at its core, it was a high-stakes competition to prove to the entire world which system, capitalism or communism, was technologically, intellectually, and economically superior.
And this race drove incredible innovation, culminating, for the United States, in the massive Apollo program and the Apollo 11 moon landing in July 1969.
Which is an incredible achievement for humanity. But it's really interesting to look at how the astronauts themselves viewed what they were doing.
Oh, yeah?
Frank Borman, an American astronaut who commanded Apollo 8, later described the Apollo missions as, and this is a quote, just a battle in the Cold War.
Wow.
It wasn't purely for the noble pursuit of science. It was geopolitical point scoring.
There's a huge silver lining there.
Right. And I want to point out this huge aha moment for you listening. While it was about point scoring, the massive government funding poured into the space race literally built the modern world.
It jump-started the tech boom.
The microchips in your computer, the GPS navigation in your phone, those technologies were accelerated directly by the need to make spacecraft computers smaller and lighter. The device you are listening to right now is a direct byproduct of Cold War paranoia.
That is a profound connection. And, it's interesting to look at how the Soviet public reacted to the Americans finally winning the race to the moon.
How did they react?
It was remarkably mixed, mostly because of how information was controlled in the USSR. The Soviet government heavily limited the release of information about the Apollo landing. They certainly didn't broadcast it live on television like the rest of the world.
So people just didn't know.
A large part of the populace just didn't pay it any attention because they weren't told how important it was. Meanwhile, another portion of the scientific and military community who did know about it were incredibly angered and frustrated that their system had lost that crucial leg of the race.
But space wasn't just about exploration or walking on the moon. There was a very dark, heavily militarized side to it, right? Satellite reconnaissance, spying from space.
Yes. Signals, intelligence, and optical reconnaissance became absolutely vital. You see, you couldn't fly planes over Soviet airspace anymore without getting shot down, so you had to look from orbit.
Makes sense.
Take the Soviet Salyut program in the 1970s and 80s. To the global public, Salyut was presented as a series of peaceful, crewed space stations in long-term orbit. Just science labs.
Okay.
But beneath that peaceful cover story, Salyut 3 and Salyut 5 were actually secret military reconnaissance stations for a highly classified project known as ELMOS.
Wait, they were putting actual military spies in orbit?
Literally.
Yeah.
Cosmonauts were up there with massive high-resolution cameras taking pictures of American military installations. They even secretly tested a rapid-fire cannon on one of the stations to defend against hypothetical American satellite attacks.
A cannon in space. That is wild.
It's pure science fiction, but it was real.
But here is the profound irony of this whole thing, and I want to highlight this for you listening. While these two superpowers are building weapons capable of destroying the Earth several times over and putting literal spy stations armed with cannons in orbit, they are simultaneously sitting down at tables in Geneva, cooperating to write the foundational laws of outer space.
It's true. And it speaks to the realization that mutually assured destruction meant they had to find ways to cooperate, or everyone would die. Self-preservation required diplomacy.
Give me an example of that.
Well, in 1963, following...
It's just crazy to think about the cognitive dissonance. Like, we completely hate each other. We have thousands of missiles pointed at each other's capital cities. But let's calmly agree not to put nukes on the moon.
It was a necessary firewall to keep the Cold War from literally destroying the planet. But that intense competition to prove which system was superior extended far beyond technology. It extended right down to human biology. sports diplomacy.
Oh yes, sports were a completely bloodless battleground, but the stakes felt incredibly high.
The Olympic Games became highly politicized arenas where athletes were not just representing their countries, they were seen as literal soldiers of their respective ideologies.
So a gold medal wasn't just a sporting victory.
No, it was touted as proof that your political system produced physically superior human beings. A prime example of this geopolitical intersection is the 1980 Moscow Olympic boycott.
Right. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In protest, the United States, along with over 60 other countries, completely boycotted the 1980 Summer Games held in Moscow.
They just refused to send their athletes.
It was a way of utilizing global culture to wage diplomatic warfare. And 4 years later, the Soviet Union and its allies retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles.
It perfectly illustrates how the Cold War infiltrated every single aspect of society. You couldn't even watch a track and field event without it carrying the weight of the global superpower conflict.
Okay, we've talked about grand strategy, proxy wars in the third world, space races, and Olympic boycotts. But I want to really dig into the psychology of this era.
The human element.
Yes. What did this actually feel like? Because for the ordinary citizen, whether you lived in Chicago or Moscow, life was defined by the pervasive, everyday fear of the bomb. You were living under the constant threat of a mushroom cloud.
The fear was incredibly tangible, and we have to emphasize that it was entirely rooted in reality because humanity came terrifyingly close to the edge of the abyss on multiple occasions.
It wasn't just paranoia.
No, the closest call, arguably the most dangerous moment in recorded human history, was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Let's walk through exactly how this happened. In 1959, you have the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro takes power, overthrows a U.S.-backed dictator, and eventually aligns Cuba with the Soviet Union.
Right.
Now, Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so eventually the USSR makes a highly provocative decision. They secretly begin deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba.
Now, to understand why they did this, we have to look at the global map from the Soviet perspective.
Okay.
The United States had already placed nuclear-armed Jupiter missiles in Europe and in Turkey, right on the Soviet border.
So Moscow felt completely surrounded by American nuclear weapons.
Exactly. So to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, secretly putting missiles in Cuba wasn't necessarily an aggressive first strike. It was leveling the playing field. It was giving the Americans a taste of their own medicine.
But for U.S. President John F. Kennedy, having Soviet nukes 90 miles from American soil was an unacceptable escalation. When U.S. U-2 spy planes flew over Cuba and photographed those missile sites under construction, the panic in Washington was immediate.
The military advised Kennedy to launch an immediate airstrike and invade Cuba.
Which would have almost certainly triggered a Soviet nuclear response.
Undoubtedly.
Instead, Kennedy chose a middle path. He ordered a naval blockade, which they legally called a quarantine, to avoid officially declaring war around the island of Cuba.
A very careful choice of words.
The U.S. Navy formed a ring of ships and told the Soviets, any ship trying to cross this line will be stopped and searched to prevent more weapons from arriving.
And for 13 agonizing days in October 1962, the entire world held its breath.
People were literally stocking up on canned food and waiting for the sirens to go off.
You had Soviet cargo ships, escorted by Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes sailing right up to the line of American warships. It was the ultimate, terrifying game of geopolitical chicken. Who was going to blink first?
It was resolved through intense back-channel diplomacy and a secret deal, right?
Yes. Nikita Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles in Cuba and turn his ships around in exchange for a public U.S. pledge never to invade Cuba, and crucially, a covert, highly secret American deal to quietly remove their own Jupiter missiles from Turkey a few months later.
It was a masterclass in brinkmanship. Both sides got to walk away claiming a defensive victory, but it absolutely terrified leaders on both sides, leading directly to the creation of the Moscow-Washington hotline, the famous Red Telephone, and that 1963 test ban treaty we mentioned earlier.
However, the tension didn't vanish forever. The detente of the 1970s eventually faded, and if we jump forward a couple of decades, we hit a year that many historians argue was almost as dangerous as 1962, though the public was largely unaware at the time.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We're back to the year 1983. Tensions are incredibly high. The U.S. is engaged in a massive military buildup under President Ronald Reagan.
And Reagan was using very aggressive ideological rhetoric, famously calling the Soviet Union an evil empire.
Right, and the Soviet leadership at this time, led by Yuri Andropov, who was a former head of the KGB, was aging, physically unwell, and deeply, deeply paranoid.
They genuinely believed that Reagan was laying the groundwork for a sudden, preemptive nuclear strike against the USSR.
And in this environment of total paranoia, in September 1983, a horrific tragedy strikes. A civilian airliner, Korean Airlines Flight 007, is making its way from Anchorage, Alaska, to Seoul, South Korea.
But the crew makes a critical navigational error.
The autopilot is set incorrectly, and the civilian plane accidentally strays hundreds of miles off course, flying directly into highly restricted, highly sensitive Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula.
The Soviet Air Force, already on a hair-trigger alert, tracks this unidentified blip on the radar. Because American spy planes routinely flew along that same route to test Soviet defenses, the Soviet military treats the passenger jet as an intruding military threat.
Oh, no.
They scramble a fighter jet, which intercepts the plane in the dark and shoots it down with air-to-air missiles.
All 269 civilian passengers and crew were killed, including a sitting U.S. Congressman, Larry McDonald. The global reaction is explosive.
President Reagan calls it a crime against humanity and a massacre.
The diplomatic fallout is catastrophic, and the Soviet leadership digs in, refusing to apologize, becoming even more convinced that a U.S. attack is coming.
Which logically brings us right back to November 1983 and a NATO simulation known as Able Archer 83.
Okay, what was Able Archer?
This was a highly realistic, massive military exercise in Europe, simulating a coordinated NATO transition from conventional war to a full-scale nuclear release.
Now, militaries do exercises all the time, but why did Able Archer almost cause World War III?
Because of the context of the KAL-007 shootdown and Reagan's rhetoric, tensions were at a boiling point. The Able Archer exercise included new, highly realistic elements, heads of state were involved, new communication codes were used.
So the Soviets were watching this.
And the Soviet intelligence agencies genuinely feared it wasn't a simulation. They believed Able Archer might be a clever cover story for an actual, imminent, preemptive nuclear strike by the West.
The paranoia was so deep that the Soviets were literally loading real nuclear weapons onto their bomber fleets in East Germany and Poland, ready to launch.
That is how close it was.
And remember, it was exactly in the middle of this terrifying window, just weeks after KA-007, that our man Stanislav Petrov had his false alarm in the bunker.
It perfectly illustrates how incredibly fragile human survival was during this period. The system of mutually assured destruction was entirely dependent on perfect information and perfect rationality.
Yet in 1983, it relied on one man in a bunker questioning a computer screen.
Exactly.
And ordinary citizens felt that fragility every single day. Children in elementary schools practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their wooden desks as if that would save them from a thermonuclear blast.
It's tragic to think about.
Families debated spending their savings on building underground fallout shelters in their backyards. The culture was saturated with apocalyptic fear.
But within that fear, you also see incredible moments of humanity trying to reach across the Iron Curtain.
Yes. You want a perfect example of the human element? Look at the story of Samantha Smith.
Oh, I love this story.
She was a 10-year-old American girl living in Maine. In 1982, she was reading the news, and she was so terrified of a nuclear war starting that she just wrote a letter directly to the new Soviet leader, Yuri Andropov.
A 10-year-old writing to the head of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. She basically wrote, "Dear Mr. Andropov, I am worried about Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear war. Are you going to vote to have a war or not?"
And incredibly, amidst all this high-level geopolitical posturing, Andropov actually writes back to her.
He does.
He publishes a letter saying that the Soviet people want peace, and he invites this 10-year-old girl to visit the Soviet Union.
And she goes with her parents in 1983. She visits a Soviet youth camp. She meets ordinary Soviet citizens. She sees that they're just normal people, and it becomes this massive, heartwarming global media event.
It was a brief, shining moment that showed that underneath the rigid ideologies and the terrifying weapons, the ordinary people on both sides were just human beings who desperately wanted to live their lives in peace.
The psychological burden of the Cold War was universal. But as we move into the final act of this 44-year conflict, the foundations of this bipolar world were starting to crack under the strain.
They really were.
The decades of stalemate, the massive military spending, were taking a severe toll, particularly on the Eastern Bloc.
Right, let's transition from the psychology to the geopolitics of the collapse. Let's look at the fall of the Soviet bloc.
Why did this massive, heavily armed superpower, which controlled half of Europe and had tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, finally collapse? It wasn't because of a military invasion. Let's look at the economics.
The root of the collapse lies in the fundamental flaws of the Marxist-Leninist economic mechanism we discussed at the very beginning. After WWII, Western Europe and Japan, helped by U.S. economic systems and the Marshall Plan, experienced massive, rapid economic growth.
Their standard of living skyrocketed. They were producing consumer goods, cars, washing machines, televisions.
Meanwhile, the economies of the Eastern Bloc stagnate. And we need to explain why they stagnated. It goes back to the command economy.
Right.
Without free market price signals, a centralized bureaucracy in Moscow cannot possibly predict the complex needs of millions of people.
Exactly. Let's use a classic example here to make it clear. Imagine a shoe factory in Siberia.
Okay.
In a capitalist system, if people want boots for the winter, the price of boots goes up and the factory makes more boots because it's profitable.
Right.
But in the Soviet system, a bureaucrat in Moscow looks at a 5-year plan and tells the factory, your quota is to produce 10,000 pounds of shoes this month.
Ah, I see where this is going.
So what does the factory do? To meet the quota quickly and easily, they produce giant, heavy, completely unwearable shoes. They meet the weight quota, the bureaucrats are happy, but the citizens have no shoes to wear.
It's a perfect illustration of how the system incentivized inefficiency. The command economy was proving entirely incapable of providing quality consumer goods, agricultural stability, or keeping pace with the rapid technological advancements in the West.
Especially the computer revolution of the 1970s and 80s.
Exactly. But for a time, these deep-seated domestic economic problems were masked.
Masked by oil. In 1973, there's a massive global oil crisis. OPEC, the cartel of oil-producing nations, cuts output and global oil prices absolutely skyrocket.
Now, this hurts the capitalist Western economies badly. There are lines at gas stations all over America.
But ironically, it throws a massive financial lifeline to the Soviet Union.
Because the Soviet Union sat on vast reserves of oil and natural gas in Siberia. So when global prices spiked, Moscow suddenly received a massive influx of foreign revenue from oil exports.
A cash windfall.
Yes, and this cash windfall allowed the Soviet leadership to essentially buy their way out of their systemic failures for another decade. They used oil money to import the grain they couldn't grow themselves and the consumer goods they couldn't manufacture.
But money can't fix fundamental political fractures in your alliances. We mentioned earlier with Yugoslavia that the communist world wasn't a monolith, and the biggest, most consequential crack of all was the Sino-Soviet split.
This is a crucial turning point. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union and Communist China, led by Mao Zedong, were allies. But by 1961, relations had completely broken down.
Why did they break down?
They were bitter rivals, competing for the ideological leadership of the global communist movement. Mao believed the Soviets had become too moderate and had abandoned true Marxist revolution.
It got so incredibly bad that by 1969, the two largest communist nations on Earth were actually fighting a bloody border conflict along the Ussuri River. They had troops shooting at each other.
And the U.S. sees this massive split. President Richard Nixon famously capitalizes on it by visiting China in 1972, initiating diplomatic contacts, opening trade, and strategically playing China against the Soviet Union to further isolate Moscow.
And then in 1979, the Soviet leadership makes a fatal cascading miscalculation. They invade Afghanistan.
Yes, a massive mistake.
Why did they do that?
Well, there was a struggling, newly installed communist government in Afghanistan that was facing a massive rebellion from Islamic guerrilla fighters known as the Mujahideen.
Okay.
Fearing that the communist government would collapse and create instability on their southern border, the Soviet army invaded to prop them up.
But the Soviet-Afghan War becomes their version of Vietnam. It is a brutal, unwinnable, decade-long quagmire. The Mujahideen are heavily supplied with weapons and funding by the CIA, a classic proxy war.
And this conflict severely drains Soviet military strength, destroys the morale of their army, and bleeds their already fragile oil-dependent economy dry.
So if we look at the mid-1980s, the picture for Moscow is incredibly grim. They are bleeding cash and lives in Afghanistan. Oil prices have crashed, exposing the rotting command economy. And they have a severe leadership crisis.
A string of elderly, sick leaders keep dying in office. Leonid Brezhnev dies, Yuri Andropov dies, Konstantin Chernenko dies. The system is just paralyzed. They realize they desperately need a younger, more dynamic leader.
And in 1985, the Politburo selects a relatively young official named Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev is a fascinating historical figure because he was a committed communist. He didn't want to destroy the Soviet Union. He genuinely wanted to save it.
Right.
But he recognized that the system could not survive without radical, immediate changes. So he introduces two revolutionary domestic policies.
Let's break these down, because they are the catalysts for the end of the Cold War.
First, he introduces perestroika, which translates to restructuring. This was an attempt to introduce limited elements of market economics, allowing some private businesses, giving factories more autonomy to try and save the stagnant command economy.
Okay, a little bit of capitalism to save communism.
Exactly. Second, he introduces glasnost, meaning openness. For decades, the Soviet system survived on strict censorship and the KGB crushing any dissent.
Right, nobody could speak out.
Glasnost fundamentally changed that. It freed public access to information, allowed citizens to openly criticize the government's failures, and acknowledged past atrocities committed by Stalin.
But as you can imagine, introducing glasnost is like opening a pressure valve on a massive boiler that has been building up steam for 40 years. Once you tell people they are finally allowed to complain, they don't just complain about breadlines, they demand the entire system be dismantled.
The domestic reforms were explosive. But geopolitically, his biggest, most world-changing move comes in 1989.
What happens then?
For decades, the explicit Soviet policy known as the Brezhnev Doctrine was that if a satellite state in Eastern Europe tried to break away from communism, the Red Army would roll in with tanks and crush the rebellion, just like in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But in 1989, Gorbachev fundamentally shifts gears. The Soviet economy simply couldn't afford to maintain its empire in Eastern Europe by force anymore. So his administration institutes what becomes jokingly known as the Sinatra Doctrine.
As in Frank Sinatra's song, My Way.
Exactly. Gorbachev's spokesperson literally used that reference. He declares that the Soviet Union will no longer intervene militarily in the internal affairs of its satellite states. The nations of the Warsaw Pact are allowed to decide their own futures. They can do things their way.
Think about the magnitude of this. For 40 years, the only thing keeping the Iron Curtain up was the threat of Soviet tanks. If we connect this to the bigger picture, that one single diplomatic decision changes the world in a matter of months.
The citizens of Eastern Europe quickly realize that the Soviet tanks aren't coming to stop them anymore. The fear is gone. And that realization unleashes the stunning, mostly peaceful revelations of 1989.
It's incredible how fast the dominoes fall in reverse. You have the Pan-European picnic in August 1989, where the border between communist Hungary and capitalist Austria is temporarily opened. The guards just let people through.
And it allowed hundreds of East Germans to flee to the West. It sets off a chain reaction.
Massive protests erupt across East Germany. And on the night of November 9th, 1989, due to a confused announcement by an East German official, thousands of citizens rush the border crossings.
The guards are overwhelmed and simply open the gates.
The Berlin Wall, the ultimate physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, a wall where people had been shot for trying to cross just months earlier, is torn down by jubilant crowds with sledgehammers.
It's one of the most powerful images of the 20th century. Following the fall of the wall, Germany moves rapidly toward reunification. One by one, the communist governments of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria collapse.
The Warsaw Pact evaporates, but the ultimate shock is yet to come.
The centrifugal forces unleashed by Gorbachev's reforms couldn't be contained to Eastern Europe. They spread into the Soviet Union itself. The various republics that made up the USSR, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, begin demanding their own independence from Moscow.
After a failed hardline coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, the momentum is unstoppable. And finally, on December 26, 1991, the hammer and sickle flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time.
The Soviet Union itself is officially dissolved, breaking apart into 15 independent republics. The Cold War is over.
Which brings up a critical historical debate.
It does.
Yes, this raises an incredibly important question, and I really want you to clarify this for the listener. Looking back at this timeline, did Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika and glasnost, actually cause the collapse of the Soviet Union? Or was the system already fundamentally doomed by its economic failures, and his reforms were just a desperate, ultimately failed attempt to save an empire that was already dead on its feet?
It is a profound debate. But the consensus among many historians is that the Soviet command economy was deeply, fatally flawed. It simply could not compete in the globalized technological world of the late 20th century.
So the foundation was already crumbling.
Exactly. Gorbachev bravely tried to reform it, but the totalitarian system was too rigid. It relied entirely on fear and control. Glasnost allowed people to realize how broken the system was, and the Sinatra Doctrine removed the military force that had artificially held the empire together.
So he tried to save the system, but by removing the fear and censorship that sustained it, he inadvertently removed its load-bearing walls and accelerated its complete and total collapse.
That's a great way to summarize it.
So the Soviet Union falls, the Warsaw Pact dissolves, and we are left with the aftermath. The world transitions almost overnight into a profoundly different geopolitical structure, a unipolar world.
Yes. For 44 years, we had a bipolar world, two massive competing centers of gravity. Suddenly, one of those centers vanishes.
And the United States is left standing as the sole remaining global superpower.
The grand ideological battle of the 20th century is decisively over, and neoliberal capitalism becomes the dominant global economic system.
And for those listening who might hear that term, neoliberal capitalism, and wonder what it actually means, it's essentially an economic philosophy that champions free trade, deregulation of industries, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and reducing government intervention in the economy.
Right. And in the 1990s, this model spread rapidly across the globe. But while the threat of global nuclear war receded, the scars of those proxy wars and ideological divisions didn't just magically vanish.
No, they definitely didn't.
The sudden end of the Cold War created new, massive challenges.
Absolutely. For one, the global triumph of that neoliberal economic model has led to massive wealth generation, but also to rapidly rising economic inequality in many parts of the world, including within the former Eastern Bloc.
Furthermore, the sudden breakdown of rigid authoritarian state control in communist countries unleashed horrific violence in places where ethnic tensions had been artificially suppressed for decades.
Look at Yugoslavia. Without the iron grip of a communist government to hold its incredibly diverse ethnic groups together, and with politicians utilizing nationalist rhetoric to grab power in the vacuum, the country tragically collapsed into a series of brutal, horrific civil wars and ethnic cleansing in the 1990s.
And you can see the ideological reckoning of the Cold War continuing actively today.
Where do we see that?
In places like Ukraine, there are ongoing vigorous efforts of decommunization. They are actively passing laws to rename cities, tear down statues of Lenin, and ban communist symbols, trying to physically and culturally sever their modern identity from that painful Cold War past.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's vital to recognize that this history isn't just a chapter in a textbook. It is the architectural blueprint of our present reality.
It really is.
Exactly. I want to remind you why understanding this 44-year standoff is so vital for you today. When you look at the news, when you hear debates about NATO expansion, when you look at the tense borders in Eastern Europe, when you see ongoing conflicts in the global South, or when you look at the massive military-industrial complexes that dominate global budgets, you are looking at the direct, living legacy of the Cold War.
The institutions, the alliances, and the anxieties of our modern world were literally forged in the furnace of that conflict.
The geopolitical map we navigate every single day was drawn by the tension between Washington and Moscow.
It really was.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. The Cold War we just spent the last hour discussing was defined by two distinct ideological blocs. They competed for global supremacy not through direct traditional warfare, but through proxy conflicts, economic embargoes, intense espionage, and massive technology races. Now, look at our modern world today. We see the rise of global internet firewalls dividing populations and controlling narratives. We see state-sponsored cyber warfare silently hacking infrastructure grids. We see massive artificial intelligence and semiconductor arms races and aggressive economic decoupling between major global powers.
It sounds familiar.
So I ask you, are we currently living in the early, quiet days of a digital Cold War? One where the battleground is no longer about holding physical territory in Europe, but about controlling the very flow of information itself. Think about that the next time you look at the news. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.